Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Well, today's the day I could finally talk about starting up the 4,200 gallon aquarium, and after more than 1,131 days of construction, I can officially say I'm out of the construction phase. I'm moving into operating this monster aquarium system, from building the fish room, building my auxiliary tanks and support systems, to building the 4,200 gallon aquarium. It has been a long journey over 3 years. In today's video, I'm going to talk about starting up this aquarium. I want to start though by just saying thank you to my wife for all her love and support. I could not have done this project without you. Thank you so much. Today's video, I'm going to talk about filling up the aquarium with RODI water, some initial ICP testing I did and some of the challenges that brought, heating the aquarium, and humidity control, which gave me some fun challenges to solve. And then I'll talk about adding salt, finally adding some life to this tank. And as you can see, there's a couple of fish in here already. When it comes to starting the 4,200 gallon aquarium, the very first thing I needed to do was fill it with RODI water. Now, I had an Aqua FX Barracuda unit that I had hot rodded to be rated for about 300 gallons per day. I've used it for almost 9 years, and realistically, with the high TDS water I have at my home, I'm only making about 150 to 200 gallons per day out of that unit. It just wasn't adequate, and it would have taken over a month to fill the 4,200 gallon display, let alone the fact that even a water change would take 4 days. And it's just not adequate for this size system. So while it did a great job in its time of service for my aquarium system, it was time to get an upgrade. Now, I chose to get a custom built RODI system from Champion Lighting and Supply. It's got a membrane rated at 2,600 gallons per day, and it is a commercial size unit, and I absolutely love this RODI system. Now, I purchased this RODI system back in the summer, and it arrived at my house the day before Thanksgiving. And after a couple of days of unpacking it, getting it into the basement, running all the plumbing for it, and going through the startup procedure, I was ready to start filling the 4,200 gallon display. And just to give you an idea of how scaled up this RODI system is, this is the standard size cartridge for my old RODI unit. This is one of the old diode cartridges, but compared that to the pre-filter cartridge that I'm using now in my new RODI system, it is a massive difference. My RODI system is just a scaled up version of a normal size RODI system. It's just a lot bigger. It has a pre-filter the water runs through, and instead of a carbon cartridge, it goes through a carbon tank that has 2 cubic feet of granulated activated carbon in it, which then goes through another pre-filter to get any carbon fines out or other debris in the water, which then goes into the booster pump, the RO membrane, which is a really tall membrane at about 40 inches, and then that water goes into another tank that holds 1 cubic foot of DI resin. And from there, the water is output to my top-off tanks or to fill up the tank. And if you're interested in anything like this, this is not something you can get on Champion Lighting and Supply's website. They don't offer it as just a product you can buy off the shelf. It was custom built by them. If you're interested in getting something like this from Champion Lighting and Supply, send them an email or give them a call, ask for Todd, and they'll see if they can build an RODI system for you. I did purchase this unit on my own. That wasn't paid for in any way. Now, when it comes to filling the 4,200 gallon display, I did this process over the course of 4 days. Now, the first thing I did was I flushed out the plumbing that was going from my 4-inch drain line into my temporary 120 gallon sump. Now, this 4,200 gallon aquarium is going to be running on that 120 gallon sump as a separate system from my fish room for the next several months. I'll talk about that more in detail a little later in the video. I flushed out the drain line plumbing as there could have been a fair amount of tap water in there from my original fill test, I pumped that water out. Then when it came to filling, I put the PEX line into the 4,200 gallon tank, turned the unit on, and let it start to fill. Now, the first night, I just let it fill for a few hours, and I wanted to make sure the RODI system was being fully attended to by me. Like any new piece of equipment, I would not recommend you just leave it on and unattended, especially something that's connected to your water supply that is going to be putting a high volume of water through it. In case there is a problem, you want to be able to observe it for a while. After the first couple days, I was finally happy everything was working the way that it should. I didn't feel I needed to watch it, so I went ahead and just left the RODI system on. And on the fourth day in the evening, the water finally overflowed through the overflow box and into the sump, filled up the sump, started up the Abyss pump, and from there it was time to just allow water to circulate in the tank. Now, it was very cloudy. There was a lot of dust on the rock, sand. There was stone fix that I had spilled while I was cementing the aquascape together. There was even some sand and stone fix on the surface of the water being held by the surface tension from the water just slowly being risen up. So the tank was definitely pretty cloudy, and the water was in the 60-degree Fahrenheit range as well. So it needed some time to just sit here and circulate and settle down. I did use a filter sock periodically just to get some of the fine particles out, but for the most part, it only just caught some little bits of sand. Now, once I had the aquarium filled and was circulating with the Abyss pump, I went ahead, let it settle down for a few days, and then I went ahead and did an ICP test. Now, I've done this as kind of a standard operating procedure in my last three systems, my old 1,600 gallon system, my fish room system, and now this display. Now, I want to just say with ICP testing, it is a great tool to get data. However, you must always be cautious with the actions you're going to take based on the data that you receive. And I think what happened with the 4,200 gallons test is a perfect example, along with the one that happened in my old fish room. I went ahead and sent the test out, and I received the results back. All the water parameters came back as normal and within range except for one, and that was aluminum. Aluminum in this display was showing at 1.8 parts per million for the display, just filled with RODI water. Now, when I received this result, I was very shocked to see this reading, because I'm going, where would aluminum come from in that heavy of a concentration? I've got over 100 pounds of aluminum in the light racks, but I did a really good job vacuuming things out, and I could imagine maybe a few little chips of aluminum fell in, but not enough to create that high of a concentration, let alone the fact, would the aluminum even stay soluble in the water, or would it precipitate out if it was exposed to water for a long time? So I really didn't know what to do. Now, I went on to the Reef Beef Discord. There's a very large amount of members there that have vast amounts of experience in the hobby and know a lot more about chemistry than I do. I've got a pretty elementary knowledge of chemistry, and I started kind of asking, well, what does everyone think of this test result? Would you do anything? And the variety of answers I got back from, draining and refilling the tank or rinsing it out. There's a lot of questions about, well, where could the aluminum have come from? I even set up a test with some plastic cups and polyfilter with, some aluminum, just aluminum from the canopy in the water, just some straight RO water. And I also went ahead and used some of the cement product stone fix that I used. I found out that they can use a chemical called calcium aluminate as part of that cement product that's used in some. I don't know if it's used in theirs or not, but those were all potential sources, and none of them made any sense to me. I've used stone fix heavily in my last aquarium system, never had problems with it, never had aluminum readings, and I've used aluminum in light racks and such and never had problems. And I really want to thank, the community for their thoughts, suggestions, and you know, a shout out to Rich Ross. You know, he brought up some really good points to me with ICP testing. He's going, this is the challenge you get with it. You get the data, but it could really change a person to trying to do things to solve it when it might not actually be a problem. And he recommended I email the ICP company about it. Now I did do that, and the response that they got me really gave me some thought that I just didn't have with my limited knowledge of how ICP works and chemistry. They came back and told me, well, they thought that reading was a bit odd. However, they stuck to the fact, they said that is possible to happen. They could retest, but then they also said, understand anything in the water, soluble or not soluble, that's in that water when it's tested will show up on the ICP. And that's something I never really thought about. And when I took the water sample of this tank, it was really cloudy because it was stirred up with the dust of the cement product and of the Marco rock in here. And the tank was much more cloudy than it is now, which I'll explain a little later in the video, because there's another reason for this. That really made me go, you know what, I'm going to throw this test result out. I'll test again later, but I don't feel that it was ever something I needed to worry about. And the fact that I've got life in here now, including invertebrates that are all doing okay, I think we're past the point of worrying about that ICP test. But I thought it was important to share that experience I had with it, because on the other hand, my ICP testing that I've done for my zinc issue that I had in my fish room system, I've got over 11 tests with data, and I know the actions I took that directly correlated to some changes in those levels over time as I gradually solved what the likely source of that zinc contamination was and my mitigation efforts to pull it out of the system. Again, ICP can be a great tool to use to get you data, but just don't ever jump to conclusions or try to take drastic steps. If you see a result you're not sure with, sometimes you should take a step back, observe, which in this case there was no life in the tank, but I ultimately decided not to pursue doing anything further. Now the next thing I wanted to cover today was heating the 4,200 gallon aquarium. Now when I put the water into this tank from the RODI system, it was in the 60s in here, low 60s. I let the aquarium sit for approximately a week and a half, and the water temperature gradually rose up to about 68 to 69 degrees, which was just room temperature down here in the basement. And once I was at that temperature level, it was time to go ahead and install my heating system. Now the heating system that I put into this aquarium is the same exact thing I've been running in my past 1,600 gallon system, and also my fish room that's 2,100 gallons. And that is a radiant heating coil system that uses a loop of PEX with a Renko temperature controller and a recirculation pump back to the hot water heater of the house. Now when I plumbed in my original heating loop for the fish room, I pre-plumbed in a second line that I could connect into when I was ready. Originally I was going to use it for my water change station, but as I started building the system out, I was like, you know, I'm going to have to heat the display tank when I start it up, because it's going to be a separate system for a few months in that temporary sump. So I went ahead and installed a PEX coil there. I had a Renko controller already as a backup anyways. And then I actually found a recirculation pump that is capable of working in an open water system. A lot of the pumps out there that are meant for recirculation are made out of cast iron, and you cannot use that in an open recirculating system where you are in the hot water supply of the whole house. You have to use something that is made of bronze or stainless steel. So I was able to find one of those pumps at Home Depot that's meant for being used on faucets, and it was available locally, so I just went ahead and picked that up. A little bit lower power and so it doesn't move as much water as quickly, but that's actually not a bad thing. We'll actually have more time to do a heat exchange. And actually, I was seeing about 20 degrees difference from the water coming into the PEX coil at the sump versus what was exiting it. It did a pretty efficient job of doing some heat transfer through that PEX coil, and it took approximately 4 days to heat the aquarium to 78 to 79 degrees. Now, it's 4,200 gallons is what I call it. Mathematically, it actually holds more water than that, plus the sump and the plumbing. So it's probably closer to about 4,400 gallons of water that needed to be heated. So to do that by 10 degrees in 4 days was pretty good. Since I've gotten it started, the PEX coils had no problem just maintaining the temperature of the aquarium. Now, the next thing that came up with the aquarium startup that I wanted to cover is humidity control. And I gotta say, this did not go to plan at all. In fact, I had some challenges with humidity control that I needed to address that I felt were actually a pretty big concern. And this all started the day that the aquarium got up to that 78 to 79 degrees. Now, I knew the humidity was going to rise in the canopy, and I did need to monitor it. But I got hit in the face pretty hard with the harsh reality of what happened in there. And it all started by turning on some lights. Now, I had 4 Radion G4s that I have in here as just temporary light over the tank. There's 1 over the fish only area, 2 over the first 12 feet of the reef, and there was 1 over the second 12 feet of the reef by the overflow box. And now I'm down a light. My fault though. So I opened up the canopy, and at the time I was just plugging the lights in. I hadn't integrated them into the Apex to do automatic turn on, turn off. And I plugged in my first light down by the overflow box. And I noticed the humidity in there, but didn't think much of it. I was like, well, we'll check it here in a few minutes. Well, then I plugged the light in. It flashed on for a second, and then it went out. And I was like, that's really strange. I proceeded to plug the other 3 Radions in. They all started up as they normally do. And I was like, well, let me go back to this one. So I tried to plug it in again, did the same thing, and I jostled the light rack a little bit that it's attached to, and a single drop of water fell out of it. And I looked at that and I go, well, that's really not good. So I pulled the light out, looked at it, and realized it was covered in condensation. I then proceeded to inspect the canopy thoroughly, closest to this light that had condensation on it. So that back wall, the back door by the overflow box was also covered in condensation. I got a humidity monitor back there, and it was in the 90s. So it was really, really bad. I'm ideally targeting being in the 50s or 60s over there, and seeing it in the 90s was bad. So I immediately got everything opened up. Now, the good news is that the rest of the basement was in the 40 to 50% range. Exactly where I wanted it to be, and the humidity being generated by the canopy was staying contained in there. Now, the first mistake that I realized I made is that my exhaust fan, which does 200 cubic feet per minute, was only at 50% speed. I had failed to turn it up to 100%. So that right there was minimizing the airflow through the canopy. So I immediately turned that up to 100%. Now that condensation greatly reduced from there, but it wasn't gone all the way. And the second thing I realized was that the overflow box was generating an enormous amount of moisture on it. You know, I had not heated the tank during the tap water test, and therefore I really didn't know how high the humidity was going to get in there because the water was at a relatively cool temperature. But oh boy, when it was up to temperature 78, 79 degrees, were we generating a lot of humidity. Now, as a first step, I took some plastic corrugated board. This is stuff, it's just like cardboard. I use it for the heat exchanger in my DIY HRV. And I put this temporary cover over the overflow box. And of course there was a ton of condensation being generated inside it. That was the point where I stopped having condensation in the canopy itself. However, the humidity level there was still at 86%, which is way too high. And I knew that I needed to do something more. So at this point, I started to measure humidity around the other parts of the canopy. Now the basement air was about 40 to 50% humidity. So I wanted to measure inside the canopy and see how it went, because the air gets pulled in kind of above my head here through an air intake, and then it flows all the way through all 36 feet of the tank to where it gets exhausted out to the fish room, where it is ducted to the whole house dehumidifier back there. Now with that in place, I was going, that should mitigate it. The fish room humidity was still in good shape. However, it was way too high in this canopy. So first, I tested at the first third of the tank here, and the humidity had risen from that 40 to 50% to about 65%. I went to the second third of the tank, put the humidity monitor in there, and it was reading about 70 to 75%. And then at the far end of the canopy by the overflow box, it was about 80 to 86%. So I could see the humidity was gradually increasing while it was going there. Now, originally I tried to take a small fan and just circulate air inside the canopy a bit, but that had no effect at all. Reduce this humidity somehow. So there's a few things you could do. The first one that I went with was eliminate the surface area of open water. So I took plastic sheeting and I covered the first third of the 4,200 gallon aquarium. It's a fish only section. It's not going to impact reef lighting or anything to any discernible effect, so it's not going to really hurt anything to have that covered. And I'm just testing now, it's just filled with RO water. So I put that plastic sheeting over, which effectively eliminated 1/3 of the open surface area of the water. That did have an effect, and that allowed me to get my humidity at the far end by the overflow box down into the 76 to 82% range, which unfortunately is still too high. Being in the 70s is something for a short period of time during a day I wouldn't mind, but to constantly be there is not good. Therefore, I needed to do another level of mitigation. Now, from here, the next thing to do was increase the airflow through the canopy. Now, we had a 4-inch inline duct fan capable of 200 CFM or cubic feet per minute. To go into a larger duct fan, 4-inch ducting has a maximum of about 400 cubic feet per minute of airflow. So I decided I'll buy an 800 cubic feet per minute duct fan in case I need to scale up and it's not big enough. So I took an 8-inch fan and I reduced it down to 4 inches, which I know really restricts how much air is going to flow through it. However, it should get me up to that 400 CFM of air at least. And when I did that, it kind of helped. It reduced my humidity down to about 75 or 74%, but it was still having periods of the day where it would get up to 80. It just wasn't enough. So the only thing I could do to increase airflow from here was to increase the duct size. So I looked at how my plumbing trellis is, how it's set up, and I realized I have enough room for 6-inch ducting to be put in there. So going from 4-inch to 6-inch duct, I knew I could probably get at least 600 cubic feet per minute of air through that. I have an 800 cubic feet per minute fan. So I went ahead and started the duct replacement. Now I did have to do some minor construction surgery for this at the time to cut out some duct supports for the original 4-inch PVC ducting. It really wasn't going to affect that structure, but it allowed me enough room to put the 6-inch duct inside that plumbing trestle. I pulled that duct all the way through, put it on the fan, turned it on, and lo and behold, I was able to pull, with that fan on high, I'm able to pull the humidity level in the aquarium canopy on the far end by the overflow box down to the mid to high 50% range if I need to. I have lowered that fan speed slightly, so it's just in the low 60s in that side of the canopy, which is about where I want it. Now, bear in mind, doing all this humidity control and having the different fluctuations in the canopy over time affected the general humidity of the fish room. It also affected the evaporation rate of the 4,200 gallon aquarium. Now, when the humidity was still out of control in the canopy and in the 80% range, I was evaporating approximately 5 to 7 gallons of water per day out of the 4,200 gallon aquarium. When I got the humidity under control in the canopy, my evaporation rate increased to approximately 10 gallons per day of water. Overall, the evaporation rate went up a little bit in the aquarium. However, the other side effect of that was the humidity raised up a few percentage points in the fish room itself, and the evaporation of the fish room system and some of the other smaller tanks has gone significantly down. So I'm still evaporating roughly the same amount of water every day between the fish room system and the big tank. It just kind of shifted what tank it was coming out of, which I thought was a really interesting dynamic with the humidity control. Now I'm going to continue to monitor it. I did put polycarbonate covers over most of the first third of the tank still to keep that going. However, if humidity control still becomes a problem in the fish room or the canopy or in the house, I'm going to start to add more of those polycarbonate covers to the display tank itself. Now that will affect how much PAR from the lighting comes through. It will definitely reduce my humidity levels, as putting covers over stuff, it just will have nowhere to go and it'll stay contained in that area. So that's humidity control, which I gotta say was not a challenge I intended to encounter during aquarium startup, but I'm glad that I got it taken care of now rather than having it become a serious problem down the road. Let's talk about adding salt to the 4,200 gallon aquarium. So for putting salt in the 4,200 gallon aquarium system, I went ahead and used Fritz salt. And I did that because it's locally available at my LFS Reef Plus in North Aurora, which thank you, Steve, for getting the salt in for me. And I got the salt level in this tank up to right around 1.027 or 35 parts per thousand. We're hovering right in that range there. And it took a total of 27 200 gallon mixed boxes to completely get this tank up to where it needed to be. Now, there were 26 boxes of Fritz that I used, and then I had 200 gallons of Instant Ocean mix I also put in. At the very beginning, once this tank had RODI in it, over a few weeks I put in about 50 gallons of salt mix a week. I was trying to just put in a little bit of salt to hopefully kind of hold back any major bacterial blooms that might have just happened with just being RODI water in the tank. And the reason I did that is during my tap water fill test, I had a huge bacterial bloom hit about 2 weeks in, and I didn't really want that to happen in this tank because it was only going to be RODI water for a few weeks, and then from there I wanted to go ahead and put the salt straight in. So I did that. I didn't have a bacterial bloom during that period between RODI filling and the main batch of salt. I don't know if adding that salt in between really did much anything because 50 gallons of salt mix in this system really doesn't do anything. So how did I get this salt into the 4,200 gallon aquarium? It's a lot of salt to mix, over 1,600 pounds of salt. And first thing I did is I did 2 trips with my car. I filled my car up with 15 boxes of salt, got it home, and I posted a video on Instagram of me sliding the boxes of salt down the stairs so I didn't have to carry them, which really, just saved me having to haul that amount of salt around very far. And to mix the salt into this tank, I try to keep it very simple. I put an extra return pump into my 120 gallon sump. And when I did that, I just got it circulating water in there, no hose or any plumbing on it, just shooting water straight into the tank. between that and the Abyss A400's intake and overflow, there was an enormous amount of water flow happening in that 120 gallon sump. And I would take anywhere from about 50 to 100 gallons of salt mix at a time roughly and dump it into that tank and stir it all up. And within 4 minutes or so, that whole tank had been completely exchanged out in water, and all the salt had been carried away into the display tank itself. And I went ahead and did that for about 3 days with the first 15 boxes of salt. I'd just add some in, and between doing things around the house or in the evenings, I would just go ahead and keep adding that salt. And knowing that as soon as the sump in the fish room was all cleared out, there'd be new water that wasn't just getting salt in it pulled in through the overflows on the opposite end. It's turning over water about once an hour maybe in the 4,200 gallon display right now with that temp sump. So once I got the first 15 boxes of salt into this tank, it was going to be a few days before another shipment of salt would arrive at my LFS. So I went ahead and took my old Reef Octopus 300 skimmer, put it onto that sump. Now I had the original C-shape pumps for it. They're just the AC motors, and they worked fine, so I was going to put them back on, except when I went to start up those C-shape pumps, both the magnets on them had split. One of them was corroding bad, the other wasn't, and it had been over 3 years since I used those pumps when I had my temp tank. So I just went ahead and put those to the side. I was going to order new impellers, but for the cost of new impellers, I could buy like a brand new DC pump. And that's exactly what I did. I just got a small Jabo return pump, and I modified it by pulling off the impeller, take it away from being a pressure pump. I 3D printed a needle wheel impeller, made my own DIY Venturi out of PVC parts, and attached that to the Diablo skimmer just to put a single pump on there, and that way I could get a skimmer started. And the idea was, even though I didn't have all the salt in the tank, I wanted to be able to start pulling out some of the sediment and dust and cloudiness in the water. That's exactly what that skimmer did. It started kind of pulling out this kind of tan, gray, almost like mud, and I think all that is just those fine particles in the Marco rock, and also some of the stonefish that were floating around the tank started getting pulled out of the water. And that's exactly what I wanted the skimmer to do. Didn't do a lot in that first week because there's only half the content of salt, but once I got my second shipment of salt in, I got the other 15 boxes in the house, and over the course of 2 days, I added most of that salt. When I got to 24 boxes of salt in the tank, and I still wasn't quite at the right level of salinity there, I went ahead and slowed down how I was adding it. I'd do like 50 to 100 gallons of salt mix, and then I'd wait a few hours, let the tank turn over a few times, and then check it again. And I did that for the last 3 boxes of salt. And finally, the second to last box, I waited overnight. Still saw it was a little bit low, so I added 1 more box of salt, and that took care of the salt content in the 4,200 gallon aquarium. It was time to start getting some life into this system as quickly as I could. Now I started by just taking a few scoops of sand out of my fish room sump tank, where I've got a few 100 pounds of sand sitting in there, and I pulled that out, put it into an area of the reef tank with some sand. I also poured some of that same sand into the non-reef safe section sand pit as well. This was just going to help to start to spread some bacteria, some copepods on the microfauna, is the hope of what I'm getting into the tank with this. I also took a couple pieces of Marco rock that I've had sitting in the sump tank of my other systems and put those rocks in here as well, just a couple of them to help start to seed a little bit of life. And that is what begins the cycling of this tank. Now it didn't take long before I started to see a lot of algae, diatoms, cyanos start to pop up. I have kept the 3 radion lights over the tank running and haven't shut them off. I don't have lighting over approximately a third of the tank, and the back half of the non-reef safe section of the tank has just a little bit of spillover light from the other lights, as I just don't have coverage over it right now. And the whole idea here is to just get this life seeded in and started. Now, after a few days, I monitored everything. Salt levels were still looking good. Everything was checking out with the humidity control still. The salinity is where it needs to be. I went ahead and added in some corals. Just a couple little frags, a little Samacora, some Jason Fox Free Care, a little spicy lemon favia, and then I had one rock with a couple Rhodactis mushrooms on it from my little 25-gallon lagoon tank. Put those in, and all of those were doing great. So kind of going back to that aluminum that I had in my ICP test, I don't think anything was really happening there because all the corals have been fine for weeks, no ill signs, everything looks okay. Now the alkalinity in the 4,200 gallon display is a little high. It's about 12.5 right now, and it's just where it mixed up, which isn't all that surprising given all the new rock and the cement products and everything used. It's going to elevate those levels a little bit, so not at all surprised there. And that's where we talk about getting some balance into the system. Because this is running separately, it's going to take some time to get balanced out with the running fish system before they can be attached together. And part of that balance process is to continue adding some life in the tank. So once I got some corals in, I also put in my favorite red bubble chain macroalgae in the tank as well, which is already starting to grow out a bit, which is good to see. And then once everything there was doing okay, I decided to add in some more complex organisms, starting with a cleaner shrimp into the reef tank. I was originally going to add the bar gobies from my 100-gallon holding tank where all the new arrivals are going to be, but it was going to be really difficult to catch them without tearing that tank apart. The cleaner shrimp, however, was very easy to catch, so I went ahead, caught that, put that in here. It did well for about a day, didn't have any problems, and at that point I was ready to put in the first fish. And for the first fish of this tank, I decided to put my Spanish hog in. This is actually the very first fish I put in my 1,600-gallon system at my old house. So I've had this fish for many years, and I just thought it fitting to go from its temp holding tank, the 150, to go into its new home, the first third of the tank here, where it's going from a 150-gallon home to a 1,400-gallon home. I gotta say, the Spanish hog looks really happy in its new home. Started eating with it the first day and has been really having a great time in this tank. But a week after adding in the Spanish hog, I decided to go ahead and move my porcupine puffer over from that 150-gallon tank as well. The reason for that was the 150 had 3 residents in it: the Spanish hog, a Regal Angel, and a porcupine puffer. And the Regal Angel can be a little bit of a bully at times in a tank of that size, so it used to kind of square off with the Spanish hog, and the same with the puffer. And every now and then there'd be a little bit of a fin nip. Nothing that ever hurt the puffer or anything, but it used to happen in that 150 because it was just a smaller temporary house for them. And unfortunately, when I moved the Spanish hog over here, the Angel no longer had the Spanish hog to kind of break up the aggression, and the Regal Angel started bullying that puffer a little bit more than I'd like to see. It wasn't doing any damage, of course, but just didn't like to see the puffer getting stressed out from that. So that made the decision real easy to just go ahead and move the puffer. Now these are 2 fish that eat quite a bit, the equivalent of about a cocktail shrimp a day, and you might be thinking that's some big fish to put into a tank like this to start it up during this early parts of a cycle, but you gotta remember the volume of water here is so enormous. I'm not looking to have a giant ammonia spike in this tank. By slowly adding things in and seeding it, getting some of that bacteria going in here and the microfauna, I was looking for that to get going. The fish have been doing well. Haven't seen any ill side effects that have in the fish in here. They've been happy and healthy, and the puffer, now that it's in this tank, has also learned a new trick, which is called spray water out of the tank when you open the top to get food, which I have to laugh about because the puffer never did that in the 150 and the 2+ years I had it in that tank, which I find a little hilarious. So now I've got a few corals in the tank, some macroalgae, a couple of fish, my cleaner shrimp, everything's going well. I'm going to start to add more life into this tank slowly, but that is how I want this tank to cycle. And I've already seen some things happen. Originally, everything got covered up with diatoms and cyano. There's a little bit of hair algae growing as well. Some other red fuzzy macroalgae and some caulerpa are also taken off on the one rock I have that brought some of that in. But in the last week, I've seen quite a dramatic change happen. You notice most of the rocks here don't look like they have much G on them at all. That's because the cyano and those diatoms basically all died off within a couple of days. And what I started to see happen then was the copepods finally started to show up on the glass. And as a matter of fact, all sides of this aquarium that I look on with the glass are completely getting covered up with copepods in the tank. And a couple days ago, the tank got a little bit cloudy. Now, I've seen this happen before where the puffer and the Spanish hog kick up some sand and it clouds the tank for a little bit, but that's not what's happening here. I thought maybe it was some kind of just bacterial bloom going on, but at least part of the cloudiness in the tank right now is due to the copepod population literally exploding in this last week. And when I look in the tank now in areas where there's a little less water flow or on the surface, there are thousands upon thousands of copepods in sight everywhere now. And it's really good to see this level of life spreading out in the tank. It's one of the signs I look for that the tank is starting this process of going through a cycle. And again, just going to continue to slowly add life to this tank. Probably going to add a bunch of corals in the coming weeks here, because I can see that all having a good positive benefit in the tank. I also want to make sure other species of corals do okay in here other than the ones I have. As far as fish go, I think right now I'm going to wait till the copepod population boom here slows down at least a little bit, and I'm going to try and move my bar gobies over to the reef tank, maybe a couple fish out of my existing reef in here as well. I'm just going to take this process nice and slow. I'm figuring it's going to take 2 to 6 months for this aquarium to be ready to be combined with the fish room that's running. And as part of balancing out the fish room system to the 4,200 gallon display, I've stopped all my dosing in the fish room system because I had turned my calc stirrer off, put the calcium reactor on, and unfortunately I spiked my alkalinity a little bit in there, and a couple corals really didn't like that. It got up into the 10s. And I prefer to keep my alkalinity generally in the 8 range. So having it spike a little bit, lost a couple little corals that had some dieback on them, but everything's bouncing back now. So all I'm doing is watching the alkalinity in the fish room system drop. When it's time to dose, instead of using Kalkwasser or the calcium reactor or a 2-part, I am simply going to do a water change between the two systems, effectively dosing water from one system to another. The other thing I'm looking to gain by this is a drop of alkalinity here and a gain of alkalinity in that tank. And once it's all balanced out, at that point, I will go ahead and add on the last segment of drain line plumbing into the 4,200 gallons drain plumbing. And at that point, I'm going to do a cutover from a temporary sump into the running system. But as I said, 2 to 6 months for that process. That's the startup of the 4,200 gallon aquarium. Hope you liked the video today. If you have comments or questions, please go ahead and leave them down below. If you like the video, go ahead, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. You can also follow me on Instagram. I do a lot of updates there with pictures and reels. I'm also on the Reef Beef Discord channel where you can have some really good interactions with some experienced hobbyists. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you on the next video.